What does Africa need above all, and what can be a Christian contribution? This is the purpose of this my intervention. We know that the Christian God is love. What we forget sometimes is that love starts from material goods, material needs, and not spiritual needs. This is what the first letter of John says. If anyone has the world's goods and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how does God's love abide in him? So, this is the reason why I want to start from an analysis of the economic situation of Africa. If we consider the gross domestic product per capita, we must conclude that Africa is the poorest continent in the world, and that the majority of world's poor live in Africa. This situation is due to something that characterizes Africa itself. In the first half of the 19th century, Japan, Thailand, most of Latin American countries were in the same situation as Africa. During this time, many African countries got a significant amount of aid. Ghana, Zambia, Chad, Zimbabwe, for example. But now we know that their economy have failed or actually have shrunk. Instead, other countries and places, Singapore, Hong Kong, Malaysia, they have expanded rapidly. So it's a situation that is typical of Africa. What are the reasons? There are many classic analyses. We can just refer to an article written by Daron Acemoglu and James Robinson. Why is African poor? 2010. This article detects 6 main reasons. 1. Centralized polities emerged later and less frequently in Africa. There are a few exceptions in Aksum, Ghana, Songhai, Mali, and or the Great Zimbabwe. But the reality is that we had very, very few big centralized polities. The second reason, technological backwardness. The wheel, the plow, sometimes they were known in Africa, but not used for work to produce. Also, in Africa, we had no writing outside Ethiopia. The third reason, when centralized polities emerged, they were absolutist and patrimonial polities. By patrimonial polities is a concept introduced by Max Weber. We mean a government where the state coincides with the ruler. The ruler possesses everything and gives everything to those who have within relationships of loyalty. Basically, the state functionaries are those who enjoy these goods. That's why we call a patronage state, where there are clientelist practices. This reality. The fourth reason is the slave trade. And this is a serious reason. When we consider slave trade, we think of the suffering of those who became slaves and were taken to the Americas. We don't think, for example, that in Africa we had a reduction of 50% of the population. Moreover, there was a perversion of all the political, social, religious institutions because everyone was engaged in this slave trade with an increase of the extent of lawlessness. The proceeds received by the African population, the African tribes, were used to import guns and ammunition to increase the warfare between the tribes. So, even when the trade slave was abolished, We had in Africa a huge use of slaves, and many powerful states were supported just by the slaves. In countries, in states like the Kingdom of Asante or Dome, and in the Yoruba city-states, half of the population were slaves. So this reason must really be taken into account. The fifth reason is the colonization, because the colonization blocked any possibility of endogenous institutional reforms. So the situation stayed frozen. The colonizer, anyway, they relied on the local chiefs. So this absolutist structure became more and more consolidated. The sixth reason is the emerging of the neo-patrimonial state after the colonization, so that the state started to create only private goods for those who were in power, and those who were not in power were enjoying nothing because the state didn't provide any public goods. Politics in this kind of state are a winner-takes-all game. This is why it's very, very important to win elections in the African countries today. Now, we can share several aspects of this theory, of this analysis about poverty in Africa. But the whole of it is quite problematic, because it's based on the assumption that the modern states in the globalized world, they represent the top of every civilization. This analysis actually is based on the theory of social Darwinism of Herbert Spencer, where the winners are also the best, or the unilinear theory of evolution elaborated by Lewis Morgan. Lewis Morgan says, since mankind were one in origin, their career has been essentially one, running in different but uniform channels upon all continents, and very similarly in all the tribes and nations of mankind, down to the same status of advancement. It follows that the history and experience of the American Indian tribes, for example, represent more or less nearly the history and experience of our own remote ancestors when in corresponding conditions. So basically, Africa is poor because it was late in the evolutionary path of the humanity. Now, the problem with this analysis is that many Africans, they unconsciously, they adopt the same analysis, and so they internalize an inferiority complex, and whenever they come across this kind of theories, they react saying that in Africa we had centralized polities. For example, the Egyptian Empire, they were writing and so on. I think that whenever Africans react in that way, they are actually playing the game of those who are considering African civilizations inferior. I prefer to reply in a provocative and ironic way, borrowing the words of a Congolese writer, Soni Labo Tansi. He says, l'Afrique cette grosse merde, où tout le monde refuse sa place. Un merdier, un manche merdier, ce monde, ni plus ni moins qu'un grand marché de merde. Africa, this big shit, where everyone refuses his place. A crappy, ugly shit, this world, neither more nor less than a big crappy markers. Now, I don't know why the current ecological crisis, the nuclear danger, unemployment, homelessness are not enough to put all the scholars in crisis and try to see that what we have reached as Western civilization cannot be considered the top of the human evolution. Moreover, the achievement of the Western world is based on the exploitation of Africa. Howard French, in his book Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War, 2021, after reading what some 18th century writers said about Africa, British expert on commerce, Postlethwaite, Raynal, a French thinker, and the author of Robinson Crusoe, Defoe. After reading this, Howard French says, Africa was the linchpin of the machine of modernity. Without African peoples trafficked from its shores, the Americas would have counted for little in the ascendance of the West. African labor, in the form of enslaved people, was what made the very development of the Americas possible. Without it, Europe's colonial projects in the New World are unimaginable. So, on this basis, I want to put forward an hypothesis. I think that African cultures are alternative to the Western civilizations, or at least they may be a very valuable corrective. And this can be based on a different theory of evolution. The multilinear theory of evolution. Every people has a relatively different path of evolution, and we can enrich each other. In this perspective, some of those considered inconveniences in that analysis about African poverty, for me, are strengths of the African cultures. For example, the lack of centralized polities and the presence of the patrimonial states. Is that always something bad, the lack of centralized polities? Let us consider the example of two tribes that had a very different development in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Bushong and the Lele. They live very, very close on the two banks of the Kasai River. The Bushong, since the 17th century, thanks to King Sham, created a pyramidal kingdom that provide a kind of richness. On the other side of the river, the Lele, they were wrongly considered stateless. They had a different social organization that has been studied by the anthropologist married to, and is based on the institution of the hohombe, the wife of the village. Now, this goes beyond family issues because this kind of institutions make sure that within the tribe, relations among villages are more important than relations within the village between the chiefs and those who are subjected to the chiefs. So, if the Boshong are rich, it's true that the Boshong are rich and the Lele are poor, but the Lele, because of their social organization, suffer less from the oppression by an upper caste of leaders than the Boshong. So actually Africans in this case, they prove to be clever, choosing a different path of living. If we consider the absence of broad use of technologies, even in this case, we have to say that many Africans, they refused this new technology. The plow became an instrument of exploitation. In the Kingdom of Congo of the 16th and 17th century, in the reign of King Leopold, and even in the reign of Mobutu in the 20th century. And even the fact that many African population didn't have a writing systems is not something bad. If we think, for example, that the most important people that constitutes the foundation of the Western civilization, Socrates and Jesus, refused to write anything. There should be a reason. That is reflected even in the myth of the two Egyptians, God, Thoth and Thanos, reported in the Phaedrus of Plato. Whenever we fix a tradition, that tradition is difficult to keep it alive over time. And as soon as it's written, a special cast of experts emerge with the claim of giving the authoritative interpretation of the scriptures, and so preventing the whole community from having an active role in the development of the same tradition. So, oral culture is not always a lower stage in the evolution of humanity towards a culture that has scriptures. As long as the slave trade, the colonization, and the emerging of a neo-patrimonial state are concerned, we have to say that, yes, these are reasons of poverty in Africa, but these reasons are not autochthonous, but are due to the direct and indirect contact with the Western civilizations. Once we have established that colonization and slave trade were the main causes of the present poverty in the African continent, can we say something more about the devastating consequences of their action? Yes, we can. If it's true that there is no basis for considering one civilization superior to another civilization, it is also true that we have relative superiorities. Now there is a dimension where the European civilizations were superior to the African civilization, and that is the magnitude of their aggressiveness. When we speak of this magnitude, we have to speak not just in terms of warfare, that is, the ability to kill someone, but we must speak also in terms of historical bloc, a concept that I borrow from Gramsci. What's an historical bloc? It's an articulated structure of dominion that acts simultaneously at different levels: military, political, economic, cultural, and religious. When the African civilization met this historical bloc of the Western civilization, it was fatal for them. In order to understand why we need to talk of historical bloc, I want to report some consideration of historian Toynbee about the encounter between civilizations. Toynbee makes us notice that it is not certain that the militarily inferior civilization automatically adopts the religion of the militarily superior civilization. In fact, after the Mongols had conquered a great part of Asia and Russia in the 13th century, those who had conquered the West were converted to Islam. Those who conquered the East were converted to Buddhism. Again, it is not certain that the militarily inferior civilization automatically adopts the culture of the militarily superior civilization. For example, when the Romans conquered the Greece, in reporting this event, Horatius said, "Grecia capta ferunt, victorem cepit." That means the Greece who was conquered by the Roman actually conquered the Roman, the savage winner. Again, it is not certain that the conquered populations harbor an inferiority complex towards the conqueror's populations. For example, the Hindus under the Muslim always had held that Muslims were impure and inferior to the Hindus. And even in modern times, a large number of Indians did not recognize the cultural superiority of the British. Now, all these circumstances occurred instead in Africa. The militarily inferior civilization automatically adopted the religion of the militarily superior civilization. The militarily inferior civilization adopted the culture of the militarily superior civilization and even at times harbor an inferiority complex. All these factors push us to think that actually the African civilization, they met the European historical bloc, and the consequence was the annihilation of the African civilization. This is the reality that is very well explained in the novel Think, Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe. This annihilation has been expressed by many theologians in terms of anthropological poverty. And this is the real problem of Africa today, in my opinion. In the words of Engelbert Wenck, this is anthropological poverty. When persons are deprived not only of goods and possessions of material, spiritual, moral, intellectual, cultural, or sociological order, but of everything that makes up the foundation of their being in the world and the specificity of their ipseity as individual, society, and history. When persons are bereft of their identity, their dignity, their freedom, their thought, their history, their language, their faith, universe, and their basic creativity, deprived of all their rights, their hopes, their ambitions, that is, when they are robbed of their own ways of living and existing. They sink into a kind of poverty which no longer concerns only exterior or interior goods or possessions, but strikes at the very being, essence, and dignity of the human person. It is this poverty that we call anthropological poverty. This is an indigence of being, the legacy of centuries of slavery and colonization. From what we have said, it's easy to realize that Christianity played an important role in the process that led to the anthropological poverty of most of the inhabitants of the African continent. To understand this role, we have to introduce another concept, the concept of hegemony. Hegemony points to the conquest of supremacy not through force and coercion, but through culture and morals. The Church, starting from the 4th century, has always sought the support of the temporal power for the proclamation of the gospel, obviously. And in this exchange, to get this support from the temporal power, the Church had to ally itself from time to time with the dominant groups in the society, and it agreed to become a hegemonic religious and ethical force within that specific society, giving birth to a Christian society, Societas Christiana, and in this process it had to consecrate the culture of that civilization, becoming the hegemonic force within that particular historical group. In order to introduce an individual or a group into its system of communication, the Church required them to take over the culture that it had adopted for itself. And evangelization became a colonization itinerary. Now, this process has been, in my opinion, described very well by Alfred Whitehead. He says, when the Western world accepted Christianity, Caesar conquered, and the received text of the Western theology was edited by his lawyers. The brief Galilean vision of humility flickered throughout the ages, but the deeper idolatry of the fashioning of God in the image of the Egyptian, Persian, and Roman imperial rulers was retained. The Church gave unto God the attributes which belonged exclusively to Caesar. Whitehead goes on, arguing that Christianity started from different assumptions. There is in the Galilean origin of Christianity yet another suggestion which does not fit in very well. It does not emphasize the ruling Caesar or the ruthless moralist or the unmoved mover. It dwells upon the tender elements in the world which slowly and in quietness operate by love, and it finds purpose in the present immediacy of a kingdom not of this world. Love neither rules nor is it unmoved, also it is a little oblivious as to morals. It does not look to the future, for it finds its own reward in the immediate present. Now, once we have acknowledged the authentic zeal of many Christian missionaries and the sincere acceptance of Christian faith by many Africans, we must also recognize that most of the Africans got on their knees before the Christian God, because the Christian God, through the civilization of the colonizers, proved more powerful than the God of the colonized. Now, to show the connection between the integration of Christianity into the Roman Empire and the cultural colonization of Africa, I want to compare two events, two victories. The victory of the Milvian Bridge by Constantine, the one who gave the church that possibility of becoming an ally of the temporal power in the West, and the victory over his pagan brother by the king of Congo, Alfonso I, in the 16th century, who is considered the real founder of church in Congo, although the first king to be baptized was his father Joao I Nzinga Nkuvu. The two events are described. The first is described by Eusebius of Caesarea, the second by Alfonso I himself in its letters to Portugal. Eusebius of Caesarea tells us that the day before the battle, Constantine and his forces saw a cross of light in the sky, along with the Greek words for in this sign conquered. In that night, Constantine had a dream in which Christ himself reinforced that message. The day after, Constantine, the emperor, marked the Christian symbol of the cross on his soldiers' shields, and he won. Let's go now in Congo, in the battle between Alfonso I and his pagan brother. When the army of Alfonso I felt that they were about to lose the battle, they started to shout, "Santiago, Santiago," invoking St. James the Major, the patron saint of the colonizer countries, Spain and Portugal, known as the Matamoro, the killer of the Moors. Moors means more or less black. Now, in that very moment, the opposite army ran away. After the victory, Alfonso I asked the survivors among his enemies, "Why did you run away?" They said that when the army of Alfonso, his soldiers, were shouting, "Santiago, Santiago," they saw again a white cross in the sky and a great number of armored horsemen, so they had no choice but to run away. In both cases, we see the God of Jesus Christ as an ally of the military leaders of the Christian population and the one who guarantees the victory through miraculous interventions. Whitehead would say this is not the God of Jesus Christ, the God of the gospel, is not anymore that God. I think it's useful to provide few examples about the way religious colonization is at work even through the most holiest things, such as liturgy and the sacraments. We know that, first, Christianity was inculturated into the Hellenistic culture, and it had to take over somewhat that Neoplatonic dualism that despises the body. So liturgy, Christian liturgy, became a liturgy that without much involvement of the body, a prayer especially for souls. The situation in Africa is quite different. Let us listen to Olochukwu Uzoku, what he wrote in his book Worship as Body Language in 1997. In African rituals, the drum not only evoked and conveyed the foundation story of the group, it often stood as the foundational story, so it is a means of revelation. More than in the Bible and Quran, playing the ritual drum in Africa elicited bodily movements and gestures, as well as mental states that made the cosmic unity immediately palpable to the hearts and minds of the worshippers. It connects people to the earth and to the spiritual beings. Few years later, in 2000, Joseph Ratzinger wrote in his book The Spirit of the Liturgy something completely different. The cultic dances of the different religions have different purposes: incantation, imitative magic, mystical ecstasies, none of which are compatible with the essential purpose of the liturgy of the reasonable sacrifice. Of course, reasonable sacrifice is a quotation of the letter to the Romans. In the book of Ratzinger, we can see how the proclamation of the gospel matches the imposition of a foreigner culture. In this case, the vision of the Neoplatonic dualism. Now, a second example comes from what happened in the States in the 19th century. It's not Africa, but black people, Africans, were involved. We know that in 19th and in the 18th and 19th centuries in the States, Catholic bishops and even religious orders were slave owners, and a segregation policy was implemented in the Protestant Church and the Catholic parishes. In the Catholic churches, African-American Catholics were required to sit in the back pews of the church or in the upper gallery, and even during the distribution of the Holy Communion, there was a kind of segregation. First, the communion was given to the whites, and only when they sat, the blacks could stand and receive the Holy Communion in their turn. Some priests even used separate vessels to distribute the Eucharist to the black and to the white parishioners. This situation stopped only when, in 1948, Patrick O'Boyle became the Archbishop of Washington. In Boston, in 1839, a new practice was introduced against this situation of segregation, not in the parishes, but in the houses of the people. A doctor organized a dinner where blacks and whites could come and sit together, eat together, and overcome mistrust and suspicion. In that dinner, even Frederick Douglass was invited. In 1940, the American Anti-Slavery Society started to organize the same kind of dinners. At the beginning, they were opposed by turbulent crowds, but already since 1947, these dinners could be enjoyed without being disturbed. These dinners really created a communion, a new situation. Now, the question is this. We know that the Eucharist makes the church. If we compare the Eucharist celebrated in the States with these anti-segregation banquets, which of these two kinds of banquets conferred the grace that creates community of brothers and sisters? Obviously, the Eucharist was used to perpetuate an unjust and oppressive social order. It was a falsification of the Eucharist. Instead, these banquets were providing a way to build that evangelical utopia. This the impression that Christianity was used as a means of colonization, cultural colonization, is quite spread among the scholars. The Nigerian Methodist leader Bolaji Indow says in his book Towards an Indigenous Church, the go-as-you-please worship services of the evangelical churches gives the impression of being more of a concert than a worship. But on the other hand, what gets Nigerians in the Roman Catholic ritual is the fact that it strongly appeals to them as a European system of incantation and magic. Bolaji writes his book in 1973 to say the opposite of what Ratzinger would say in 2000. They use the same word, if you have noticed, incantation. Even Mercy Oduyoye said something similar in Hearing and Knowing. She says that it was the spiritual power of the salvation history what bewitched the African. So again, we speak of magic as a way through which the African Christianity worked as a means of religious colonization. I think that even today, an African who wants to become a Christian must also become a European. I will give you an example, a nice example. Let us look at these beautiful statuettes. Now I ask you, how many African Catholics would accept to use this beautiful statuette as a support for the monstrance during a Eucharistic adoration, for example? Almost no one. This is because Africans, they see something pornographic or indecent in this statuette. But this statuette has nothing pornographic. This statuette, in the civilization that produced it, is rather a hymn to life. Africa has reserves of spirituality for the whole world. Let me elaborate two aspects of this spirituality that, in my opinion, are very relevant for the globalized Western civilization. First, we know that the core of Christian theology is personalism. It is very well expressed by the parable of the lost sheep. The good shepherd can put on the line the lives of 99 sheep in order to save the lost sheep. Well, this personalism in the Western society today is falsified, has been turned into individualism. We don't have any more communities or community life. The market has reduced us to masses of solitary consumers. In any case, the Western civilization was able to formulate the rights of the human being, but not the rights of peoples, the rights of communities. Now, this reality doesn't exist in Africa. In Africa, what is important is the community. They teach us the beauty of living in community, where a person exists. Oh, there is even a lizard. A person exists in a reciprocity of relationships. It is not coincidence that African art is full of masks. In the Western world, a mask may have a pejorative meaning, but that has not always been like that. At the beginning of the Christian theological reflection, we find a mask that helped the theologians to produce the theology of the Trinity. Persona, prosopon, in Greek, means mask. Moreover, this vision of the world that has in the center the community can help us also to get out of the pensée unique of the neoliberalism and redefine the way we organize our economy. We have some clue in the Okuni people tradition from Nigeria, where we find two interesting sayings. They say, Okpak Oni Oko, the poor has nobody, or a rich person is called a Thang Ane, which literally means being wealthy of people. So we see that concept as poverty and wealth are defined in a relational way. Let's go to the second aspect. We know that one of the pillars of the Western civilization is the Greek philosophy. And the main important question of the Greek philosophy is the question for the being, the mystery that envelops everything. Now, in this process, Heidegger accused the West of having forgotten the ontological difference. That is, the difference between the being as the mystery that concerns everything and the single entities. In the Western world, in the attempt of capturing the being, we have objectified it together with all the world, going on with the process of abstraction, believing that whenever you can conceptualize something, you may catch the essence of it. But the result has been the reduction of everything to object. We think that we understand something when we know what we can do of it. This has been for Heidegger the reason of the birth of technology in the Western world. This has not happened in Africa. When a Westerner looks at a tree, he or she already sees a table, a chair, Instead, in Africa, when someone looks at a tree, he or she glimpses the whole mystery of being and life. And this leads not to dominating the world, but to live in harmony with the being and the life of the world. This is why African spirituality is a sacramental spirituality, which through the sign of visible things always goes towards invisible things. To prove that, I want to give you some example considering African art. We will go back to the conception of art in the Western world. For Aristotle, art is mimesis, imitation. Art has to express, to represent the reality and express the splendor, the symmetry and proportion hidden in the reality. Art is a representation of beauty that is offered for contemplation. We can see that, for example, in this beautiful statuette of a pregnant Mary. The apex of this conception of art can be found in the Italian Renaissance, for example, and later on the Western world started to realize that there is a surplus of the reality that this representation can't get. And so this kind of art lost fascination. Art in Africa has always been something different. African art appears ugly to the Africans themselves because African art is based on asymmetry. It's based on disproportion. It's based on obscurity. African art disturbs and perturbs. This is because it's a symbolic art. It's not offered for contemplation. We are invited to refer to something that is beyond, to the invisible dimension of the reality. African art that is a living art because it expresses itself in rituals is revelation. A revelation that is not offered fixed in sacred scriptures, and so doesn't produce heretics and fundamentalism. After arguing that the anthropological poverty represents the main issue on the African continent, we can ask, what can Christians and especially Catholics do about it? We must say that since the years of the struggle for independence, Africa has been fighting for the recovery of its identity. It's not just a question of doing archaeology, that is, following a cultural identity that no longer exists. For example, today the cultural uniformity of isolated tribes doesn't exist anymore. African cities are pluralistic. This is why activists, intellectuals are following new different paths. For example, Ngoge wa Dhongo speaks of decolonization of minds, and this is the reason why he refuses to write his novels in the language of the colonizers. Now, churches must just follow suit. First of all, churches must recognize that they have taken part in the project of cultural imperialism by placing themselves on the side of the powerful. It's not coincidence that in Europe, Since the 14th century, the hierarchical church has always opposed all aspirations for emancipation. Only after a few centuries of delay and after many condemnations did the church come to accept scientific development, democracy, human rights, citizens' freedoms, modern economy, socialism, women's emancipation, and even some aspects of the sexual liberation. The Church could have accompanied these movements by evangelizing them, but it did not. The Church could also have evangelized peoples without exporting Western civilization, in analogy with what Buddhist missionaries did when they brought the message from India to China and Japan. But it did not. In her book, African Catholic, Decolonization and the Transformation of Church, 2021, historian Elizabeth Ann Foster says that in the mid-20th century, under the pontificate of Pius XII, when Archbishop Lefebvre was the head of the Franco-African Catholic Church in Africa, the Catholic Church worked together with the government of France for the realization of a Franco-African Catholic world, knit together by Catholic faith, Catholic education, Catholic press, and Catholic charities. It was only John XXIII who opened for the reconciliation of Catholicism and African culture. Churches, they didn't support the movement for liberation of the African countries. The contribution of the Christian churches to the liberation from the colonial rule was only indirect and involuntary, through the spread of school education, for example, and through the teaching of evangelical principles. Mercy Oduyoye says in his book Hearing and Knowing, African converts were free to oppose their traditional rulers, but not the missionary or the colonial government. They were the equal of the missionary and the white man before God. But for as long as they had to deal with the missionary, they were minors, people of inferior everything. The missionary were veritable bulls in the African culture China shop. Having acknowledged this situation, the churches should draw the necessary consequences and undertake a path that we can call of pastoral and missionary conversion, using an expression of Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium 25. Some people think that the current challenge for the African church is theological. We should fight the spread of atheisms. But we forget that the problem of the atheism is a problem of the Western world, where the marriage between churches and power, not a sacrum commercium, but an execrabile commercium, took to the issue of the secularization. Other people think that the current challenge for the African church is Christological, because As John Beattie stated very well, all African societies have a notion of God as the supreme being. So what they lack is the reality of the incarnation. And so the main concern of the African churches should be the proclamation of Jesus. But we forget that it is not a problem for Africans to accept the only mediator between God and the human being, Jesus Christ. This is a problem in Asia, where religions have already many mediators, like Krishna, like Buddha. If instead our analysis is correct, we must conclude that the current challenge for the African church is ecclesiological. The churches should stop claiming their hegemonic centrality in the society. And this is a problem that Giulio Girardi calls ecclesiocentrism. To overcome ecclesiocentrism, this should be the pastoral and missionary conversion required for the African churches. Moreover, in Africa, ecclesiocentrism finds fertile grounds thanks to some drawbacks of African communitarianism, namely tribalism, the tendency of the individual to identify himself with the community. Mercy Oduyoye says Christian denominations have ended up replacing the tribes. And John Pombi from Ghana wondered, are we preaching the same Christ? Anglicans, Methodists, Roman Catholics? If so, why are we at each other's throats? For Jesse Mugabe, denominationalism is the plague of Christianity in Africa. At times, I myself have this impression. In certain provinces of Catholic religious institutes, where we don't have much mystical tension or the commitment to the transformation of the reality is absent, I can see that the energies of the people are channeled exclusively into the development of those same religious entities, as if these provinces were new tribes to which consecrated people belong. How can we overcome ecclesiocentrism? When Lutheran theologian Moltmann tries to define Christian identity, he looks at the life of Jesus up to its conclusion on the cross. The crucified Christ lived and died for the others. This is what we call the pro-existence of Christ. It was not mere philanthropy, because we are speaking of full identification with all the oppressed and the abandoned. The centrality of this love of total sharing shows that the Christian identity is defined by a specific anthropocentrism, which in this perspective is not opposed to theocentrism, but constitutes its criterion of authenticity. Whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. Now we can realize that ecclesiocentrism, the centrality of the church, stands as an alternative to the evangelical centrality of love. So our pastoral and missionary conversion is a passage, an Eastern passage from ecclesiocentrism to Christian anthropocentrism. Paul VI, in the opening address to the fourth session of the Council, said, "In this world, the Church is not an end in itself. It is at the service of all human beings." We can say that the Church is an end only to the extent that it is a means. Following the pro-existence of Jesus, the Church must not seek its affirmation over the other, but for the others, with the others, in the others. Whoever loves wants the freedom of the others, does not consider them the object of his or her intervention, but first of all, subjects of initiative. We are subjects of love, not objects of love. In this sense, the most important concern of the Church should be the human being in their nakedness, and not the rites, the doctrine, the morals, the laws of the Church or its possessions. The Church ought to choose to be present in the world in the manner of the crucified. Martin Luther would say, sub contrario, under the opposite appearances. For example, we should acknowledge that the true glory of the Church, like the divine one, manifests itself in the opposite of the human glory. Now let us offer some practical suggestions. Already Pope Francis is giving to the Church a project, the synodal path. I think that we should go more and more in depth. Christ spent most of his life listening. We should follow the suggestion of Elochukwu Uzuku's book, A Listening Church. We should really try to deeply listen to the Africans, especially the oppressed, giving them first the freedom of speech. And we should be able, as a church, to listen to more their hearts than their words. Maybe it should be appropriate, a moratorium, a time when hierarchies and leaders chose to be silent. This would be the first step toward a proper inculturation. José Comblin says, inculturation occurs first in the unconscious, in a mysterious way, when communication between people occurs. Culture then intervenes at another, more external level. The primary task is to be in tune with people. In this sense, the African Church can carry on the mission to help the Western churches to rediscover what is essential in Christianity, for them to get rid of that cultural crust that has settled on the gospel over the centuries. Finally, for listening not to be hypocrite, the upper and middle classes within the Christian communities should learn to share more and more their lives and resources with the lower classes. Instead of building bigger and bigger houses for God, we should start looking after the houses of the children of God. Mahatma Gandhi used to say, sanitation is more important than independence. I think that Christian anthropocentrism is the Christian way to overcome for us the African anthropological poverty. In his homily of September 14, 2015, Pope Francis explained the meaning of two expressions: the cross without Christ and Christ without the cross. I think that the Pope echoed a question posed by theologian Jean-Marc Heller that summarizes what we have said so far. In 500 years of Christianity in Africa, the West has chosen Christ without the cross, while the people of Africa leave the cross without Christ. How can we articulate the crucifixion of Jesus and the historical suffering of our people? This question could help African churches to discern the ways of Christian anthropocentrism. If we accept to look at the reality from the cross, sub contrario, said Martin Luther, we might perhaps discover something truly extraordinary for us Christians. Africa constitutes the geographical tabernacle of the presence of Christ for the whole world. And I like to be in this chapel.